Welcome back, everybody, to another installment of Lectures for History 1301. The last time we went over pre-Columbian America, however, today we're going to change our focus and move a little bit forward and finally get to the year 1492, discuss why it's so important, and ultimately discuss who were behind, or what nation was behind making that year so important. And so today we're going to turn our focus from talking about the indigenous peoples of America before Columbus to talking about Columbus and the Spanish Empire as it was being constructed out in the Americas. And today we're going to be focusing on Spanish exploration. Now, with that in mind, the first question we must ask ourselves, why that year 1492? And more particularly, why the Spanish and why the Europeans? Why do they begin to explore by this moment in time? Well, there are several motivations to why we'll see the Spanish begin to reach out by the late 1400s to explore not only the Americas, but also other regions across the world, including Africa as well as Asia. By the time we get to the 1400s, we're going to start to see that the Middle Ages that had dominated Europe were coming to an end. Now, we didn't go into detail at all about the Middle Ages, but all you need to know about that period is what we'll see is there's weak centralized governments. Particularly, we'll see that landlords are going to have most of the power. But by the 1400s, we start to see the emergence of much larger states like England, like France, as well as Spain, to where the king would be the focus of the government as well as society, as opposed to these landlords. So one of the reasons we start to see that the Europeans will begin to explore during this period was because of the centralization of power. Other reasons for why the Europeans are going to begin to explore is also going to be the fact that we start to see an emerging middle class, which is going to contribute to the centralization of power. On top of that, we're also going to see that the Europeans are looking for a way to go around specifically the Middle East. Now, in 1453, we're going to see that the Ottoman Empire is going to conquer Constantinople, or what is modern-day Istanbul. Now, once they conquer Constantinople, all trade going to Asia particularly will have to go through the Ottoman Empire. Now, why is this going to prove problematic, especially for the Spanish as well as for other European powers? Well, it's because when they go through the Ottoman territories, they have to pay taxes. They have to go through a middleman. Now, the last thing that the Spanish as well as other European powers want to do is pay these taxes. They're going to try to find a route around paying these paying the Ottoman Empire. And so this is where they're going to begin to look for other routes to go to eventually get over to the spice trade that we see emerge out in Asia. We'll see in particular the Portuguese are going to turn their attention south from the Iberian Peninsula to try to circumnavigate Africa. And we'll see by the 1450s and a little bit beyond, the Portuguese will begin to establish colonies all throughout Africa. They will circumnavigate the continent and they will begin to arrive out in the Indian Ocean and eventually to India to avoid the middleman. But the problem with the route going around Africa is, as we all know, Africa itself is an extremely large continent. It takes roughly about 6 months for you to travel from Portugal to India, and you have to leave at the right moment in the year, because if the currents or the winds weren't in your favor, that trip could be 8 or even 12 months. And this would be extremely costly, especially for these explorers very earlier on. And therefore, many Europeans, notably that of the Spanish, as we'll see here in a minute, are going to begin to look westward. Now, contrary to popular belief, by the 1400s, as we start to see the Renaissance really begin to take shape, where we see the rebirth of classical ideas throughout Europe, most Europeans did not believe that the Earth was flat, something that maybe you've heard in grade school. Many of you started to believe the idea that the Earth was actually round. However, they did not understand the true size of the Earth at that particular moment in time. They believed that there was a vast ocean that extended out to the west beyond Europe, but they believed on the other side of that ocean was Asia. They did not realize that there were 2 whole continents in between them. Now, the Spanish are going to take it, or be the first power to take advantage of trying to go west to find new trade routes over into Asia. And this is where we'll see our friend Christopher Columbus come into play, which I forgot to write this on the board, but once again, another motivation for exploring was trade. But anyways, we'll see in 1492, as this idea was becoming particularly popular, this is where Christopher Columbus is going to come into play. Now, Columbus himself He was he had been a long-time sailor. He actually had grown up in the port of Genoa and eventually took up the seafaring trade as a result of his father. But anyways, he became enamored with many of the ideas that we were seeing promoted by the Renaissance, as well as this new theory that was being promoted that the world was not round. And by the 1490s, he was going for, or I should say from the late 1480s to the early 1490s, Christopher Columbus was going from royal court to royal court throughout Europe to try to get funding for this expedition to go westward to hopefully find a trading route to India. Now, eventually Columbus will get that funding from Spain. And the reason Spain is going to fund this was because they had recently finished what's known as the Reconquista, to where they had kicked out the Muslim Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula and reinstated Catholicism as the dominant religion within what is now the modern-day nation of Spain. Now, with the end of that set of wars, this allows for a lot of money to be freed up to where they could then invest it into other ventures, namely a route going off to the west. Now, for the Spanish nation under Ferdinand and Isabella, they're going to be interested in Columbus's mission because if he were to succeed, if he were to find that trading route out into the west, well, it could mean large amounts of colonies for the Spanish as well as more riches for the Spanish Empire. And they will fund Columbus's expedition, but there will be a few strings attached to it. They're not going to provide him with an overwhelming amount of funding. We'll actually see for them, it will prove to be a low-risk, high-reward type situation to where they will give him basically 3 rundown ships, but they realize if he were to succeed and come back, it would actually be a major success for them. And then Christopher Columbus is going to begin his journey out to what he believed would be Asia as well as India in August of 1492. Now, you don't have to remember the particular dates, but do remember that year 1492 when Christopher Columbus, as the old jingle goes, will sail the ocean blue. Now, the feat that he's going to obtain over the course of the next several months is truly remarkable because one thing we need to understand, the Europeans had no knowledge, even the Romans and even earlier civilizations had no knowledge of the Atlantic Ocean. None of them had traversed this ocean. And as a result, we'll see that he would encounter currents as well as winds, and he could have been blown completely off course, but nonetheless, despite the odds against him, Christopher Columbus, by October of 1492, will eventually find the Caribbean islands, find landfall, and rediscover the Americas. Now, on this note, 1492, I do want to point out that Christopher Columbus is not the first European that will discover the Americas. You can date back European discovery and exploration of the Americas back to the age of the Vikings. However, why his date is particularly significant is because from 1492 moving onward, there will be a continuous contact between the two worlds. The old world being that of Europe, Africa, and Asia, and that of the new world, which will consist of the Americas. Now, when Columbus first lands, he will begin a process of enslaving the peoples and establishing the Spanish Empire within the New World. Now, by 1493, he will then return back to Spain, and word of his discovery is going to quickly spread across Europe, to where, especially aided by the printing press, we'll see most of the peoples of Europe, not just Spain, but also most of the other nations, will begin to hear wind of this recent discovery. Now, Columbus himself, he's not going to believe that he's discovered any new continents. This is the reason why we're not known as North and South Columbia, but rather he believes he has merely just founded islands off of Asia, particularly off of India. If you ever wonder where Native Americans get that name Indian, is because Columbus will dub them the Indios, or the Indians, believing that they were people of India. Now, Columbus himself will return back to the New World 4 times, but eventually he will fall out of favor, be jailed by the Spanish crown, and as mentioned before, because of that, as well as the fact that he does not believe he discovered 2 new continents, this is why the Americas aren't going to be named after him. Rather, they will be named after one Amerigo Vespucci, who will basically map much of what we see of the Americas by 1499. But anyways, nonetheless, the Spanish are going to realize that they have discovered something much larger than just a few set of islands that we see off of the Atlantic coast. Because they realize perhaps there's large land masses that are in this area that were ripe for conquest that they could then bring into their empire. And by the beginning of the 1500s, we'll start to see that the Spanish Empire is going to send over further explorers to try to discover truly the extent of the American continents. Now, by the early 1500s, we're going to see a group known as the conquistadors are going to begin to arrive in the Americas. Now, there's going to be hundreds of conquistadors that will explore North America, Central America, as well as South America. However, I'm only going to highlight just a few who are important to our tale for American history. Now, we will see that some of these conquistadors, namely that of Hernan Cortez as well as Francisco Pizarro, are going to come to conquer those two great empires that we see over in the New World, namely that of the Aztecs as well as the Incas. Now, the first major empire that the Spanish are going to encounter when they arrive over in the New World is going to be that of the Aztecs. By the 1510s, much of the Caribbean islands as well as much of the Gulf Coast had already been mapped by the Spanish. However, they were starting to hear word of tales of gold, especially within the region of what we would call modern-day central Mexico, to where there was this vast empire filled with riches. And by the end of the 1510s, Hernan Cortez, particularly of these conquistadors, is going to lead an expedition into central Mexico to not only explore that region to see if these legends as well as rumors were true, but also he's going to look to establish a Spanish colony and conquer the Aztec Empire. Now, he will land in central Mexico by 1519, and most of the people outside of the Aztec capital at Tenochtitlan are actually going to welcome Cortez. And we'll see he will have an easy pathway eventually to the capital city at Tenochtitlan, and by 1521, we'll see that Cortez will capture that city. Meanwhile, we'll also see that the Spanish, it wouldn't be much longer before they begin to target the other major empire that we've discussed that was present in the New World at this time, that of the Incan Empire. After the success of Cortez's conquering of the Aztec Empire, we'll see that the Spanish crown under Charles V by the end of the 1520s is going to begin to hear of rumors of another great and rich empire that we see out in Chile, out in South America. Now, ironically, the second cousin to Hernan Cortez, a man by the name of Francisco Pizarro, is going to appeal to King Charles V to try to get funding for an expedition to go conquer this empire. Charles V, who is high off of this recent conquest of the Aztec Empire, is going to give funding for this expedition for Pizarro to invade the Inca Empire. Now, the Inca Empire, when it's invaded by 1531, when Pizarro's mission or his expedition begins, it was in a weakened state. It had been weakened by civil war as well as disease, which was running rampant as a result of the arrival of the Europeans by this point. And their population had been decimated. And it will be basically a cakewalk for the conquistadors once they arrive by the 1530s. After a short engagement, especially with the fact that they were their weaponry far outmatched that of the Incan Empire, we'll see that the conquistadors under Pizarro are going to quickly take hostage the Incan Emperor, and with it begin to drain the gold in the vaults of the Incan Empire and add it to the Spanish Empire. By 1538, we'll see that the Incans would be no more, but resistance would carry on for the next several decades, but their empire, in effect, had collapsed. Now, Pizarro as well as Cortez, they are the most successful of the conquistadors because they have conquered two of the largest empires that we see not only in the Americas but in the world at that moment in time. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier on, there are hundreds of conquistadors, many of which we have not heard of because they won't be as successful. But similarly, they are going to be fueled by rumors of gold as well as riches in the lands throughout the Americas. Now, just to highlight a couple, one man that comes to mind is that of Francisco Coronado, who's going to march northward here after hearing tales of gold, or I should say cities of gold, that were all throughout New Mexico. Now, as we all know, there is no city of gold within New Mexico, but this is not going to dissuade Coronado, who will lead an expedition into north New Mexico by the 1540s to try to conquer much of that region and get those gold as well as that glory for himself. However, he'll quickly realize that there's no gold there or out in the Great Plains, and his expedition will end in complete failure. He's one of those conquistadors that will begin to explore the North American continent, especially what we would recognize today as the modern day United States. There will be other conquistadors who would be similarly unsuccessful. Another that comes to mind is a man by the name of Narvaez, who would lead an expedition along the Gulf Coast to try to find lost cities of gold, if you will, along the regions of the American South. Well, his expedition will end in complete failure in 1528. We'll actually see that he will be killed himself after a storm has decimated his flee. Now, there will be a few survivors, and ironically, they're going to land very close to where we are presently at. They will actually land on Galveston Island. Now, the most notable of those last remaining conquistadors would be a man by the name of Cabeza de Vaca, who's going to go on an 8-year journey throughout much of what we would recognize as the American Southwest, as well as northern Mexico, to where he's going to document the local peoples, to where he would serve as a slave and later as a healer for many of these local tribes, and establish the first contacts that we see between those local tribes and the Europeans during this early period. And eventually he'll arrive back in Mexico City by 1536, and his exploits would then, or he would then write down his exploits in a memoir that he would publish in Europe, which would only galvanize more conquistadors to come over to the Americas. And I think it is noteworthy, I should have probably mentioned Cabeza de Vaca before Coronado. His account will actually influence Coronado to go northward because he believes there's lost cities of gold there. Now, there will be several other conquistadors. We'll also see that Hernando de Soto is going to arrive in the American South in places like Mississippi, Alabama, as well as Florida. And he'll be the first conquistador that will go up the Mississippi River. However, in 1542, he will meet disaster as he will be killed traversing that river. But nonetheless, these would be the first European explorers who would begin to march throughout what we would recognize as a modern-day United States. Now, for these conquistadors that go into North America, there will be a few colonies that will be established. We'll see a colony will be established in Florida as well as in New Mexico. But outside of those colonies, we'll see that the Spanish, while on paper they will claim that much of North America will fall under their authority, they're not going to establish very heavy presence in the region. They're not going to have a lot of settlements, colonies, and so on and so forth. But anyways, with that said, now that we've started to talk about Spanish exploration throughout the North American as well as the South American continents, let's talk about the formation of some of those first Spanish colonies and see how they are eventually going to be similar and differ from the English colonies that we'll talk about here in the next couple of lectures. Now, collectively, after Spain has conquered much of what we'd seen on the American continents, they will rename them New Spain, which will effectively be their colonial system throughout the New World. Now, from New Spain, we'll see that it will not become heavily populated. We'll see that landowners, mainly the nobility back from over in Spain, are going to dominate this region, and they are going to be given what are known as encomiendas, large parcels of land that they would govern in the name of the Spanish king. Underneath them, we would see much of the local population that would be present within New Spain. Now, much of the locals within New Spain, they are not going to be what are known as peninsulares, or those who were born over in Spain. But rather, they're either going to be Creoles, which are going to be individuals of Spanish blood with a Spanish mother or both a Spanish mother and a Spanish father who were born in the New World. But for the bulk of their population, it's going to consist of either mestizos, which is going to be the descendants and the ancestors of Spanish as well as Native American parents, or they are going to be the native local inhabitants. Now, with this very large population that outnumbers these Spanish colonists that arrive in this region, we'll see that in order for them to be subjugated, the hope of the Spanish Empire was to have them assimilated. We'll see that they will try to convert them over to Catholicism. They will try to impress Christian beliefs amongst these groups, as well as their beliefs in land ownership and their social hierarchy. However, in many cases, we'll see that the local inhabitants will be very resistant to this. However, New Spain, it will not see widespread revolts that will be successful for a variety of reasons. Most notably because we'll see that after the arrival of the Spanish, we'll start to see that disease is going to decimate these local populations. The estimates are that there was roughly as much as 90 million people living in the American continents with the arrival of Columbus in 1492. However, over the course of the next couple of centuries, we'll see that roughly about 90% of the local population of the Americas is going to be killed from disease, most notably that of smallpox. And this is one of the consequences of what's known as the Columbian Exchange, so where we see this continuous contact between Europe as well as the New World. Now, on that note, as we start to see that much of the population dies of disease, this will contribute to why you won't have widespread uprisings. And the few that do occur are going to be brutally suppressed. However, by the 1600s, we'll see that the Spanish Empire, while it might have been mighty, while it may have been the largest empire up to that point in history, it was beginning to collapse, and we start to see that some of these revolts would become successful, demonstrating the downfall of Spanish authority within the Americas. And most notably, we see that with the Pueblo Revolt that occurs in 1680. Now, the Pueblo Revolt itself, it will occur after we see the Spanish begin to religiously persecute, if you will, the Pueblos people in northern Mexico. Now, the Spanish Empire establishes a colony within New Mexico by the 1590s, and they will have a permanent settlement within that region, or a permanent colony within that region, for the course of the next several centuries. However, as we see the arrival of these Spanish, these Pueblo peoples are going to begin to ally themselves in many cases with the Spanish, mainly because they see a benefit to these Spaniards. Because these Spaniards have what's known as a boomstick, or the gun, something that other native populations did not have, and they could use this to provide protection for themselves against local tribes, namely that of the Apache as well as the Navajo tribes that we see in New Mexico. However, in exchange for this, the Spanish were hoping that if they gave them protection, they would begin to assimilate and adopt Christianity. Now, in some cases, we do start to see that the Pueblo population begins to accept Christianity. However, for the most part, we'll see that they will only adopt certain aspects of Christianity into their own religions. They will actually add Jesus, the Virgin Mary, as well as other biblical figures into their larger pantheon of gods. Now, by the 1680s, the Spanish are growing frustrated with this. Now, over in Spain, there was a series of religious persecutions against mainly Muslims and Jews, and we'll see very similar around that same time as the Inquisition back over in Spain. We'll see back over in the New World, Franciscan priests as well as Franciscan friars are going to begin to persecute many of those Native Americans who did not fully adopt Catholicism and Christianity. Now, as they are doing this, the Pueblo population will begin to grow resentful, especially as alongside this point, we also see famine was beginning to become rampant, as well as a drought within New Mexico. And by 1680, with a religious figure by the name of Pope leading a revolt against the Spanish, we'll actually see that this revolt will be successful. It will kick the Spanish out of that dominion for the course of roughly the next decade. However, the Spanish will eventually return. Now, in the meantime, the Pueblos Indians, as they are kicking out the Spaniards, we'll see that they are going to destroy Christian imagery, any resemblance of Western civilization, and we'll see that they will also target priests as well as colonists, massacring, if I remember correctly, roughly about 21 priests, as well as over 400 colonists in the ensuing revolt. Now, they will rule themselves independently of Spain for the course of the next decade. However, that will begin to crumble by the beginning of the 1690s for two reasons. One, Pope, that religious figure that had helped lead this revolt, is going to die in 1690. And two, the Apache and the Navajo, the main enemies of these Pueblos tribes, they are going to once again threaten the Pueblo Indians. And they will seek out the Spanish for protection, for guns, for horses, and so on and so forth. Now, the Spanish by 1692 will reassert their authority within New Mexico, but this episode demonstrates to us that by the end of this century, Spanish authority within the New World was on the decline. And as we'll see when we talk about in our next couple of videos, around the same time, during the 1600s, while Spain may have had the largest empire in the world, they were starting to see some rivals appear off the Atlantic coast in North America, namely in that of the British, the French, as well as the Dutch. We'll talk about them here in a little bit. But anyways, this concludes our lecture for today over Spanish exploration. Make sure that you read the required readings, read the textbook, and take the quiz for the week. But anyways, everybody take care.